You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Jonathan Turley. You've seen him on television, and you've probably read some of his writings. He's written on his own blog and has appeared on almost all the major networks, Fox, CBS, NBC, and the BBC, of course. He's written for the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. He's rightly deemed by the Washington Post as the Dean of Legal Analysts. Professor Turley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We are discussing today your new book. It's called The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. I'm a big fan of subheadlines. Free speech in an age of rage. And what struck me about the subhead is it's not free speech in the age of rage, which to me is very telling, because in your book, you talk about how rage has permeated our republic, our rhetoric, our human existence. Why did you choose to name your book, subhead your book, Free Speech in an Age of Rage?
That's a very perceptive point to start with, Robert, because originally the title was this. It was actually the entire title. That was the original title, standing alone. But one of the editors actually changed it to The Age of Rage, and I had to change it back because I used the expression "the Age of Rage" years ago, and a lot of people have cited that. I did not mean to suggest that this was the only age of rage, and one of the points of this book is that we have gone through these periods. The Indispensable Right, it looks at the personalities and periods that have shaped our understanding of free speech. And it takes you through the historical periods that are linked to the present day, and how in these moments of great fear and anger, free speech is often the first victim. And this country has dealt with rage rhetoric rather poorly. We still have a hard time dealing with it, even though in many ways this country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was a rageful act. It was a criminal act. And it is celebrated as the magnificent moment of a free people asserting their independence. But the funny thing is, after the revolution, we had a very difficult time with people who engage in that type of rage rhetoric to the present day. But what the book tries to illustrate is that our current period is perhaps the most dangerous anti-free speech period in our history. And that's one of the reasons why this book took 30 years to write, because I didn't want to write just another free speech book. I wanted to write a book that explored why free speech is indispensable. That's what Louis Brandeis called it. And everyone seems to agree that it is indispensable, but not why. And that's the reason I think we continue to struggle with free speech, because we lost our way. We had a clarity at the outset of our republic, and we lost it within a few years.
You mentioned that earlier. And actually, I think we talked just for a few minutes before we started the podcast about the interview I did with the incomparable George F. Will, who called your book Indispensable, which is pretty damn nice and on point. Is it so much, and this is discussed in your writings, let me ask the question this way. How has technology amplified the worst parts of human nature when it comes to rage speech?
There's no question that the internet and mass communications have allowed people to reach a much wider group. And that has been used by the anti-free speech movement as a rationale for shutting down speech, for declaring speech to be disinformation or misinformation or malinformation. Mm-hmm. And the argument is that we've never faced this type of threat before. That's not true. In fact, one of the things that I go into in the Indispensable Right is how much of the language being used today by those favoring censorship are the exact terms used at the start of the Republic. Things like fake news was a term back then. There's nothing different. Back then, when the printing press was invented, it was cited as a reason why we need to censor speech, because now rage rhetoric is more dangerous because you can actually print these words and hand them out to people on the street. Now, of course, we have the internet. It's the same voices. It's the same thread-worn rationales. What's different is the alliance. We've never seen an alliance of the government, the media, academia, join together with the media, and to put this sort of unified front together against free speech. And it is succeeding. This is a powerful alliance that has been assembled with the government. And the book looks at how we can regain the ground that we have lost, how we can have a reawakening of free speech. One of the things this book talks about is that for years, many of us were watching this wave approach from Europe. The anti-free speech movement has been raging in Europe, as well as in places like Canada, for decades. And free speech is in a free fall in France, Germany, England. They're criminalizing more and more speech. People are being arrested, ministers who question homosexuality. In England, they arrested some woman who was praying to herself silently. Yeah. And this has become the new normal there. There are many people in this country, particularly in academia, that want to replicate that in the United States. And it's no accident that when Elon Musk bought Twitter and said that he was going to dismantle the censorship system and reveal the Twitter files, the first thing Hillary Clinton did was she called out to Europe to enforce European laws against Twitter, to use European laws to censor American citizens. That is how close this is now to our shores.
You are probably one of the most unique scholars when it comes to being, I'm going to call it, for the purposes of this podcast, the axis of censorship. So we're not going to say it's evil, even though it is pernicious, but the axis of censorship. You talk to media all the time. You talk to reporters all the time. You are, for years, taught law school and involved in public policy. I know from following your career literally for more than 20 years, 30 years, you're no raging right-winger. So, how do you personally, when you interact with the proprietors of this censorship effort, how do you handle it when you say, "Hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about what you're trying to do here for free speech?"
Honestly, I never thought that I would see our current situation in the media or academia. I never imagined it could be this bad. In academia, faculties have purged professors who are conservative, Republican, libertarian. And in self reported surveys, in one, they showed that over 40% of departments didn't have a single Republican. It's very common for most schools not to have more than one or two conservatives out of 100, 120 faculty. And the media, it's become now the same way. This movement began in some ways in the United States in higher education, but the media has caught up with a vengeance. I've worked twice under contract for CBS, twice for NBC, BBC. I've written for all the major papers as a columnist. And once again, I didn't see it coming because you have to be sawing at the branch you're sitting on to be a journalist or a columnist against free speech. But the media is now thoroughly anti-free speech. We just had yesterday this is just the latest op-ed in the New York Times saying that free speech is out of control and the First Amendment has to be re-examined. The media has praised anti-free speech books. One of my colleagues is arguing for rewriting the First Amendment because she says that it's excessively individualistic. And she has language that was praised on NPR and other news outlets to allow the government to limit speech in the name of equity. That's where the media is. And part of it is that the J schools years ago rejected objectivity as the cornerstone of journalism. And I have a whole chapter on this in the Indispensable Right. And it goes into how this movement began to reject neutrality and objectivity in favor of advocacy. And that is now the view of every J school, major J school that I know of. And it's also now the view of editors. There was a poll done last year, and the editors uniformly said that they no longer accept objectivity and neutrality in the media. Now, they do this even though, as I detail in the book, they're killing their companies. That is, these companies are failing. The Washington Post has lost $77 million in the last year. They've lost half of their readership. And they brought in a new editor from England who they want to fire because he came and told all of the reporters, and this is a direct quote, "Nobody's reading your stuff." That's what he told them. And yet, as an academia, it doesn't matter. And so the public is going to other sources for media. And that is evident in the numbers that we're seeing.
I've done public relations. My graduate degree is in medieval history. Somehow I transferred from that to doing public relations and political speech writing and stuff, even though I have to say I do have a running joke that when they say, "What is your medieval history degree? How is that helpful?" And I'm like, if you want to understand conservative minds, a medieval history degree is actually very helpful. But to your point about new sources, and I want to get into some of those before we get really into the meat of your book in terms of the history of rage speech, censorship, and all the above. I used to tell folks who complained about Fox News, Rupert Murdoch didn't create Fox News. Dan Rather did.
It's funny because a lot of my friends were surprised that I went to Fox News. I really enjoyed my time at Fox News. I've never had anyone at Fox News, not a single person, ever suggest a viewpoint to me. I've never received any pushback from anyone as to what I've said, even when it's been critical of Republicans or the former president. But what's also interesting for me as someone who's worked for the various networks is that studies show that there are more Democrats who watch Fox News than CNN. It also has a younger viewership. And the question is why? Why is Fox so large? The ratings on Fox is otherworldly, and I'm not saying that in boasting because I'm the teeniest of parts of Fox, so it's not because of me, but Fox is the numbers that Fox puts up when I started in television would have been considered impossible for a cable network. And it often will be larger each night than MSNBC and CNN combined. But to me, it's an amazing story. I remember I was one of Brit Hume's first interviews at Fox.
The brilliant Brit Hume. Brilliant.
And Brit and I had worked at his previous network together. And he had left on Friday, called me, I think, on the weekend and said, "Can you come in for an interview?" And I said, "Brit, you're not with the network anymore." He said, "No, I've joined a new network. I'm with Fox." And I said, "Wait, Fox? You mean like the Simpsons Fox?" And he said, "Oh, for God's sake, no, we're creating a new cable network." And this shows how clueless and dumb I am. Because I said, "Brit, are you out of your mind? You're going to go up against CNN in a brand new network?" And he said, "Just shut up, come in, do the interview." So I went in, and it was 2 folding chairs and a camera. And I remember thinking, my good friend Brit has lost his mind, and I'll have to support him when he is homeless. And it just shows how little I know about the media, because now when I look back and see how Fox has grown, it's really breathtaking. The numbers they put up. CNN had that presidential debate. Fox still beat CNN. Fox was still number 1 in ratings. It's stuff like that the media has changed. And that's not the trajectory that we used to see. So there's a lot about this new media that is still surprising to me. It's fun to watch, quite frankly.
We should note that no TV show or entity in America has done a more accurate job of predicting the future than The Simpsons.
You know what? That is true. And I recommend it for your son who's going to law school. It's an excellent place to pick up legal doctrine and lessons.
We are talking with Professor Jonathan Turley. You know him from various television appearances and his blog and newspaper columns. His new book is The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And just so you aren't fooled into thinking that this is some sort of conservative tome, let me read that Nadine Strossen, former ACLU president, described this book as a magnum opus. Strong words indeed. Much of what you write involves the history of free speech, of the principle of it, of the suppression of it. Why was it important for you to go back to Socrates, to go back to the times of medieval England, to demonstrate not only that free speech was something people fought for, but free speech was something that not only people fought against, but they legislated against long before our First Amendment?
Yeah, I wanted to delve deeply into this subject. The whole point of writing The Indispensable Right was to try to figure out what free speech is. It is remarkable how everyone talks of free speech, and yet no one seems to agree on what it is. And that's part of the reason why we continue to have these struggles in the courts, because they have no better clue, in my view, of what free speech really is and how you have to deal with it. So I tried to go back to where the earliest sort of expressions of free speech and the efforts to protect it. So I went back to ancient Greece because they used 2 different terms for free speech. One was essentially speaking in public in the agora, but then the other one was speaking privately, and both used the same reference to free speech. And the reason I was interested in it is because I wanted to explore why free speech was originally protected. And part of my criticism of what has happened after the American Revolution is that we abandoned that moment of clarity. That if you look at the writings of framers and the people that influenced the framers, many refer to free speech as a natural right, not a right that came from the government, a right that belongs to you as a human being, whether you believe it is because of the nature of human beings or whether God gave that right to you. It was something that adheres to you as a human being. And so that idea of a natural or autonomous right was captured in the First Amendment. The most revolutionary act of the revolution was the First Amendment. It was nothing like it had ever been stated before. The simple statement that Congress shall not limit free speech or abridge free speech, period. That clarity was something we hadn't seen before or since, really. Even when the French developed in the Declaration of Man their idea of free speech, they basically stated the First Amendment, but then Lafayette, who drafted it, added, as long as you comply with the law, it's subject to the law. So even Lafayette, when he went to France, didn't go as far as we did that we did ultimately in the First Amendment. So what happened was that within a few years, the courts adopted what I call a Blackstonian or functionalist view of free speech. That is, the courts began to say, we protect free speech because it's good for democracy. And the marketplace of ideas type of argument is a functionalist argument, that we protect it because it's good to have lots of ideas because it advances democracy. And it does that, but it does much, much more than that. And the reason I talk a lot about it is because once you say that you protect free speech because it has a function to play in democracy, then you protect some speech less if it's not viewed as positive for democracy. And you'll notice that in the column yesterday in New York Times, the author who was complaining that the First Amendment was out of control was saying that we have to go back to protecting free speech to the extent that it's positive and good. That's where you end up on the slippery slope that we have been on for a couple of centuries. The alternative is this autonomous view that free speech isn't just to protect democracy. It does that. It's not just because of the marketplace of ideas, but it's because it makes people fully human, that you can't be fully human without it, that we have a natural desire to project ourselves in the world around us. And the book even goes into how you even have physiological reactions if you're denied the ability to express yourself. Parts of the brain actually shrink if you don't use them because we're hardwired for expression. So if you believe that free speech is a natural right, then there are fewer trade-offs to be made. You allow good speech to defeat bad speech, but you allow most speech to be spoken. I say most because there are exceptions.
That one of the reasons why, as parents, we celebrate our babies' first words?
It is funny because the book does go into things that we consider to be trivial. And one of the things I say in the book is I've always been fascinated by doodling. And when I teach free speech in class, I often walk around and I point out when my students are doodling. And I ask them, why did you do that? And they get all flustered and they go, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was. And I said, no, that's the point. You didn't know you were doodling. There's nothing wrong with doodling, but you didn't know you were doodling. And that is the point, that we have this natural desire to create things, to express things, to capture things. And the image of the starving artist is an example of that. Someone who would rather starve than stop creating. All of those impulses shows why we're hardwired for speech and expression. And that's what the Indispensable Right begins with, because it tries to explain why it is that we protect this right.
Among the founding fathers, in the gallery of geniuses and rogues and heroes, does one person stand out to you as the foremost and fiercest protector of free speech?
That's a really great question, Robert. It's the reason I laugh is that this book, I enjoyed writing the book because it tells the stories. They're often very colorful of our villains and our heroes of free speech. And I was really captured by what George Bernard Shaw said when he said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. And that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. And this book is about, in part, marvelous, just magnificently unreasonable people. And they come in so many different shapes and colors, right? You have people who were communists, feminists, anarchists, even fascists. They shared one thing. They wouldn't shut up. They really believed that they had a right to speak even if no one else was listening. And I respect that. They were willing to go to jail. Some of them put their lives on the line. Now, one of them was Whitney, Charlotte Whitney, Anita Charlotte Whitney, who the reason I begin the book with her is that it was her case where Louis Brandeis called free speech indispensable. And the reason I started with that is because that case captured everything that's right and wrong with free speech in America. Because Whitney was the product of wealthy family that went back to the Mayflower. She was actually connected to multiple families on the Mayflower. She was the niece of Justice Field and spent summers with him. She was sent to Wellesley and to get an Eastern education. And they were taken to a settlement house in New York. And they were supposed to be there for a few days. She stayed for 4 months. And what she saw was abject poverty and suffering. Now, while I disagree with her political views because she ultimately became a communist, I respect the fact that she saw suffering, she saw poverty, and she wanted to do something about it. And that took her to fairly extreme political views, but many views that are today mainstream. She was a major feminist leader, fought for the right for women to vote, and she fought against things like lynchings. So in California, when she returned there, she was told if she continued to speak like that, she'd be arrested. And on the day of her arrest, there were police all over the crowd and a policeman standing behind her. And she refused to yield. And she gave a speech against the lynchings happening of African Americans around the country, and she was promptly arrested. And she was convicted. And it went to the Supreme Court where the two great civil libertarians, Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes, were sitting. These are the great dissenters, these two people who could see a horizon in law that their colleagues could not imagine. And yet, Holmes and Brandeis signed off on her conviction. Because Brandeis and Holmes were not heroes of free speech, particularly Holmes. Holmes was responsible for some of the most anti-free speech opinions in the history of the court. Indeed, I commit an entire chapter of The Indispensable Right to Holmes, because I say that if you really want to figure out how we lost our way as a nation, figure out how Oliver Wendell Holmes lost his way. And it's a fascinating story. And it gives you an insight into the flaws of this sort of functionalist Blackstonian view of free speech.
Would you consider John Adams a hero or villain of free speech?
John Adams most certainly is not a hero of free speech. He is, indeed, I would say, the greatest villain in this book. He was a terrible hypocrite. And he had described the Boston Tea Party as majestic. He wrote this powerful account of the Boston Tea Party after he returned to Boston and praised this action of citizens. When he became president, he proceeded to try to arrest all of his political opponents under the Alien and Sedition Acts. And he arrested members of Congress. He arrested journalists. He arrested ministers. He had no tolerance for political opposition. It was a disgrace. Even Jefferson and Madison started to write in code when they wrote each other because they didn't want to risk people reading what could be viewed as seditious speech.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Professor Turley, is there a Hoosier leader and or legend you particularly admire? I know it's not General Burnside. So other than
yeah, I'm afraid it's not Burnside, who does not come off very well. The interesting thing is in the book is when we get to the period of Abraham Lincoln, of course, you had a lot of copperheads in Indiana, and they were the subject of crackdowns by the Lincoln administration. Lincoln was also a disappointment. He suspended habeas corpus. That was unconstitutional. And I think that Abraham Lincoln knew it was unconstitutional. But he also certainly knew that the crackdown on free speech violated the First Amendment. But he had people like Burnside and others impose military law and arrest writers and editors who spoke against the war. And copperheads were high on that list. And Lincoln showed a sensitivity that Adams did not. Adams later in his life tried to walk back a bit and even blame others for the crackdowns, but it's not very persuasive. But Lincoln during the period showed more empathy. And he would often decide that people should be deported or banished rather than put into jail. So he's a very complex figure in that sense, but he was still wrong. And people like Andrew Jackson was a terrible violator of free speech. And he was a lawyer. He knew what he was doing. But when he was in charge of the military law, the martial law system of New Orleans before and after the battle, he was the worst of tyrants. He was shocking in his disregard of free speech and virtually every other right.
This quote's not in your book, but it's one that I've read many times, and I think I'm going to get this right. Lincoln was being criticized for his prosecution, his drive to arrest and banish copperheads, Confederate sympathizers, people like Clement Vallandigham, who you mention in your book. But Lincoln says, "May I shoot the boy who decides to desert but not touch the hair of the wily agitator who induces him to desert." Do you think that there's some logic there, even if it's just convenient Lincolnian logic?
I don't believe that's a faithful rationale. One of the things that I go into in this book is that people often call me a free speech absolutist. That used to be a compliment, but I'm really not. There are some limits, but it is true that I resist most limits on free speech. One of the things that the book tries to explore is drawing the line where we punish conduct, not speech. And so, no, I don't believe that we should be able to criminalize those that even call for revolution or rebellion. I believe that is protected speech. If your nation can't survive dissenting voices like that, then it loses its legitimacy to survive. What you need to punish are the acts that are criminal. So an example, I talked about these anarchists who were arrested by the thousands during two different periods of our country. And they were arrested because of their writings. But in one case, you had a group of anarchists who encouraged revolution, which I think is protected. But then they went forward and they had a conspiracy to build a bomb to kill an industrialist. Now, even though that conspiracy was carried out orally, it's speech, that can be criminalized because you are what you're doing is conspiring to do this specific act of building a bomb, which they ended up building. So you punish the conduct. But otherwise, no, my general view is you should not criminalize speech.
One of the words that is most prevalent in your book, and you do a terrific job of not defining it, of explaining it in a way that was really new to me. Where does sedition land on your list of treasonable offenses, jailable offenses? And why did you choose to make sedition such a huge part of your book? I really learned a lot about its nature, its intent, the difference between sedition and treason, that sort of thing. Please, sedition is a huge part. Why?
The book argues, and I've argued this in academic journals for years, that we should get rid of sedition offenses off of our books, including seditious conspiracy, which was used in a handful of cases on January 6th. The reason is that we have something of a sedition addiction, that while we don't use it a lot, we keep it on the books because we like the stigma. We like to say that you're a seditionist, not just punishing your acts, but because sedition goes more to your views and what you wanted to occur. When I drill down on where sedition originated, it takes you to the Star Chamber, because what happened is England was never good on free speech and still isn't. England has never had a good period on free speech. This is one of the reasons why our Constitution should be such a matter of pride for people, because we broke off from the English tradition, particularly on free speech. But in England, they criminalized speech from the very outset. But even the English judges had problems when the Crown would accuse people of being traitors because of what they said. So people would be arrested for making jokes about the king or saying rude things about the queen, even bawdy jokes. They would arrest them for treason. And the English judges, while they were very responsive to the Crown, drew the line there and said, this is a crime with elements, and they're not here. This statement wasn't trying to overthrow the country, and they certainly didn't meet those predicate offenses. So what the Crown did is it created the Star Chamber, which was created in large part to criminalize speech. A lot of people don't realize that. And the Star Chamber was a sedition tribunal. And so people who could not be charged with treason were pulled into the Star Chamber, where they could be punished for their viewpoints and denied virtually every protection. We made changes in the American Constitution to put an end to Star Chamber proceedings. And sedition was not picked up as sort of a central theme in our constitutional system. It's not treason is mentioned, not sedition. What happened then was John Adams turned back to the English tradition, and they re-embraced sedition in the form of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And they went at it with a vengeance, just as bad as the Crown. We've kept it on the books, even though we go through these highs and lows. And fortunately, we have not had a lot of sedition cases recently, but we've had a renaissance of sedition with the January 6th cases. In my view, these charges for sedition are completely superfluous. When I have a long section on January 6th, and I look at those charges, and what is most notable is that those seditious conspiracy charges add nothing. They are totally redundant. That is, what is seditious conspiracy today is violating virtually any federal law. So it is a mirror image of the other charges, and it does not add any new time to the other charges. So we're doing it simply because we want, as the English Crown did, to punish people for their dangerous viewpoints. And so what the book says is we can break the sedition addiction, get rid of it. finally break from it. Madison in 1800 wrote a powerful paper in which he talked about sedition and said it's the monster that lives within us, that it's always there. And when we get afraid and when we get angry, the monster comes out. And what this book argues is it's time for us to slay Madison's monster. Just get rid of sedition and focus on criminalizing the acts. You still have treason, you still have all those other high crimes, but get rid of sedition.
Is there a Supreme Court decision and a Supreme Court justice whom you think gets free speech basically correct? This indispensable right?
I've always loved Hugo Black's statement that he made, that he said, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging. And I love that statement because it captures the fact that very few parts of our Constitution are as clear and concise as the First Amendment. And there's a reason for it, right? Because the people who drafted that, including James Madison, believed free speech was a natural right. And that's why the language is short. That's why the language is concise and clear. And Hugo Black captured that. The funny thing is that law professors celebrate Oliver Wendell Holmes. First of all, because he was one of us, right? He was a law professor. He was highly educated. In some ways, he's one of the great villains of the book. He created the soundbite that is still being used to support censorship, and that is this business of crying fire in a crowded theater. And I go into great depths of where that came from and how it came into his opinion. But I actually spend a lot of time on his life. And in some ways, this book corrected a viewpoint that I long had. I've been teaching this a long time. And I always assumed that Oliver Wendell Holmes's hatred for natural law was due to his service in the Civil War, because I had read a great deal of his accounts from the Civil War, the carnage he saw. He was the most unlucky soldier in the history of warfare. He would walk on a battlefield and be shot almost immediately. He was wounded 4 times, including at his first battle. He was left basically for dead once. His father, who was a celebrated physician and a great poet, one of the great poets of his time, came from Boston and rescued his son to nurse him back to health. But it was very clear from those accounts that it shook his faith. What I found out when I was doing this book is that I was wrong. That it's pretty clear that Oliver Wendell Holmes was an atheist, in my view, when he was at Harvard as a student. And it's also very clear from his writings that he had rejected natural law then. The reason I spent a lot of time on this is because it's not just that he came up with these horrific anti-free speech opinions for a person who is brilliant and recognized so many rights. It's just his vehemence that's off the charts. When Holmes talks about natural rights, there's an intensity, a hatred for it. And I wanted to figure out where that is. What I basically concluded was that he had rejected natural law at Harvard, but it was on the battlefields of the Civil War that he completely severed any willingness to consider a transcendent right of any kind. One of the things I noticed, I found out that in his bag of books that he took to the battlefield was Hobbes's Leviathan.
Oh, yeah.
And I note in the book, I said, of all the books you should not read on a battlefield, it is probably Hobbes's Leviathan. And I think that book had a big impact on him because he became someone who not only rejected natural law, but he became a positivist, someone who just viewed law as whatever is lawfully constitutionally created. That's what gives it legitimacy.
I want to ask about one specific free speech case. And it was interesting because it happened while I was in the military, and I was in the Army from 87 to 90. And it was a source of discussion among those of us who were paying attention to it. And that's the 1989 decision in Texas v. Johnson, in which and I think I'm going to get this mostly right. A man was arrested for burning a flag. It was outside the Republican National Convention, not even 88, it might have been 84. And he was fined and sentenced to jail. And the Supreme Court later ruled 5-4 that burning the flag is protected speech under the First Amendment. How would you
Yeah,
characterize that decision? And because famously, Scalia voted with the majority.
absolutely. And that's what I loved about Scalia. We were friends, and I thought that was one of his great moments. I agreed with that decision. The American flag is a symbol that most of us revere. The very idea of people burning the flag really does fill me with rage. It makes me very angry because my father fought for that flag, his father fought for that flag, and his father fought for that flag. We've been fighting in wars in this country going back to the Revolution. And it's a terrible thing to do, but it's also a symbol. And the thing that defines us is not that flag. What defines us are the rights that we share with each other, most importantly, free speech. And as I say in the book, we're often a nation at rage. We were born in rage. We are currently in one of those ages of rage. But rage is not what defines us. Free speech defines us. And that means that it comes at a cost. And that includes people who would desecrate things that we hold dear, symbols and ideas that we hold dear. And I think that Scalia got it right. And I think the case was rightly decided.
This wasn't part of the argument that to properly dispose of a United States flag, a used or worn out American flag, you burn it. So if you arrest someone for the reason he is burning it, you therefore are attacking the act in and of itself is encouraged as a way to dispose of the flag. If you arrest someone for burning it for a different reason, then it's the speech, thought, or expression you're actually arresting.
Well, I think it's clear that you're arresting them because you hate what their ideas are and how they're expressing them. And this is what's difficult with being an advocate for free speech, is that you tend to be stuck with people that you despise. You end up defending people that you find appalling and grotesque. And I've had to represent people who I disagree with entirely in every aspect of their viewpoints, except for one, their right to speak. And that's the price, unfortunately, for being a civil libertarian. And that's what the indispensable right goes into, is all of these colorful characters in the book. I disagree with all of them, but they're magnificent because they were so unreasonable and they were so committed to being able to express themselves when everyone was telling them to shut the heck up.
Including Hoosier legend, Eugene Debs.
Yes, and Debs is a great example. I quote him at length in The Indispensable Right because his closing argument to the jury was wonderful. Here you've got this socialist who knows that he's going to be convicted. The judge hates him, has made it clear that he won't accept anything but a conviction. And he just stands up and gives this in-your-face, I repeat everything I said, and I have a right to say it. And just if you convict me, it won't matter one bit. It's you, not me, that is violating our values. And of course he was right. And of course I disagree with his views, his political views. But he was an inspiring figure. He went to jail. He ran for president from jail. And that's why I emphasize that we can have heroes we disagree with. It's part of what I think is lost in higher education. I have a long chapter on higher education. And what's lost is a diversity of thoughts and interests on our campuses. When I went to University of Chicago, I loved it because it was like, for me, the Star Wars bar scene. It was like all these crazy people. I lived in this vegetarian cooperative. I wasn't vegetarian, but it was the coolest thing I could do. And it was where the book The Jungle was written. In fact, I was in his room, which was, by the way, the worst room in the house. And but down in the basement, Trotskyites would meet every Friday. Next door, we had libertarians. Upstairs, we had militant vegans. And I loved every minute of it. I thought they were all crazy. But I loved the fact that we could look at very similar things and come out with such different ideas. And I feel sorry I have 4 kids, and they just don't have that on campuses. Now, viewpoints run from the left to the far left. There's virtually no one on the faculty that is a dissenting voice on many of the things that divide the country. And it's a loss because they don't get it. For me, it was a smorgasbord. You like it's so many different things to choose. And now it's a happy meal that's been made for you, but nobody's particularly happy.
I wonder who at the Trotskyite gathering brought the ice pick, or if anyone had that sense of humor. We'll see.
Well, the funny thing is, they came to me and said, "We need 5 people to be a club at the University of Chicago. Would you join?" And I said, "But I think you're crazy." And they said, "Could you, if we need you, would you just sign on? Because we can't be a club. There's only 4 Trotskyites on campus." And I said, "Okay, go try to find a 5th one if you can, and then I'll sign if you need one." And they finally found some poor slob, I think, in the cafeteria who was willing to be a Trotskyite.
It's one of the reasons why, and I've worked for, like I said, a lot of Republicans, whether it was Mike Pence or the Republican Party when Mitch Daniels was governor, or Republican Mayor Gray Ballard here in Indianapolis. It's one of the reasons I sign every petition.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
no, it's actually, I think that's right.
If they come to my house and they say, "Hey, we're out canvassing for such and such," unless it has something that denigrates the military or veterans, I'm like, "I'll sign." And they're like, "Really? Why? Are you do you agree with us?" I'm like, "No, I think you guys are all mouth breathers who's been sucking on paint chips." But
yeah, no, I agree with you.
But you're out here, you're participating in the democracy, you're trying to get your voice heard, and I love it. So yes, I'll sign your petition.
No, I agree. And when I first came into teaching, I fought hard to get critical feminists on the faculty at Tulane. And I disagree with critical legal studies, but I teach it. I teach philosophy in one of my courses, and I teach critical legal studies. I teach a great variety of different viewpoints because I want my students to be able to talk about it, to think about these views. I was disappointed. Some of the young faculty I supported ultimately became the part of the movement to purge faculties of conservatives, libertarians, and dissenters, even though they had to hide their viewpoints 30 years ago to get on faculties. They became even worse in their intolerance. And I never imagined I would see this level of intolerance. I talk about in the book how currently the level of hostility and intolerance is stifling. Professors will write me on my blog to highlight something happening on their campuses. And I'll say, "Why don't you write about it?" And they say, one of them said, "Look, I'm 52. I need this job." And people don't realize that what this movement does is they take everything from you that an intellectual values, publications, associations, they even can fire you. And there's one guy in North Carolina who they had pushed into court 3 times. And he had to fight for his job because he was a conservative, won all 3. Then they found out he told some stupid joke to friends at a restaurant, and they put him under investigation again. And this time they were able to convince him to resign and to reach a settlement. And on the last day that he would be a professor, he went home and he blew his brains out. And I think what people need to realize is what it means to an intellectual to lose everything. For him, on his last day, that was going to be the last day that he could do the only thing he ever wanted to be. And it was all going to be taken away. That's why this anti-free speech movement is so successful. It is unrelenting, unforgiving, and most faculty members have remained silent, even as their colleagues are being fired and pursued.
Unconscionable. Before we continue, it's 4:30. How much more time do you have?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave soon just because I have to drive a kid to the airport.
5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. We'll do 5 minutes. And I'll make this very quick. There is a new push for free speech protections for the exchange of ideas. It's the free press. Nellie Bowles and Barry Weiss, excuse me. Are you a fan of the free press? And what do you think of what they're trying to accomplish? Because to me, along with Musk's purchasing of Twitter, these are the two most powerful pro free speech, pro ideas movements happening right now.
No, I am a big fan of that and other movements. I'm a big fan of Musk. I have a big picture of Musk in the Indispensable Right. And I'm fascinated by Musk. What he did for free speech will only become clear, I think, with time. But he may have been the most singular force in turning the tide. He not only revealed the Twitter files, which confirmed the long denied censorship program, but this was really a case of the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. And he was the immovable object. Up until Musk, this alliance of the government, corporations, academia, media crushed everyone in their path. Corporations knuckled under. It's an alliance that just cannot be resisted until they hit Musk, the richest man in the world. And he told them to go take a leap. And they hit him with everything they had. They've been squeezing his revenues. They vilified him in the media. And it just made him dig in deeper. And what he did at Twitter, now X, cannot be overstated. And the fact that Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all of those companies have still not revealed their files. Even after it's been confirmed that there's this massive censorship system, Facebook is still working to maintain the greatest censorship system in the world. It's X. It's the former Twitter. That is the only social media platform that I use because of what Musk did.
We ask 5 questions of all of our guests. We don't have a little red light the appeals court or the Supreme Court has, but I know you have to leave in a few minutes, but I think we can get through these. Professor Turley, what was your first job?
My first job was as a soda jerk at 31 Flavors. I was underage and lied about my age. And so I've confessed that, and I'll probably be prosecuted.
In today's climate, yes. Number 2, what was your first concert?
Wow. My first concert's easy because I grew up in Chicago and I'm a big blues fan. And I would sneak into Kingston Mines to hear the music there. And I think I fell in love for the first time there when I saw Big Time Sarah, who was appropriately named, walking up and down the bar singing, "I was built for comfort, not for speed." And I just thought, my God, that is the future Mrs. Turley. But she would have nothing of it. So, and I was only about 15. So what can you do?
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I'd like to recommend a new book called The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. But there are great books out there that I could recommend. Some of the books that I like the most included Professor Stone from the University of Chicago, who wrote about free speech. It's entitled Perilous Times. It's a little bit old, but I praise that book in my intro.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I'm tempted to say, as a Cubs fan, to be there when the Billy Goat curse happened, just to say, no, let the goat stay. But I think that if it was going to be any event, boy, that one's a tough one. It might be with Socrates, with the hemlock. There's a lot of speculation about what occurred there. But I think that I would have to ultimately go with Philadelphia to be there at any moment in any place with James Madison. As my family will tell you, my house is filled with James Madison busts. I even have bullheads. And just on my desk, I have two. This one's nice because it has a capital behind it. And I have his bust here. I have a life-size Madison over there, which is a cutout. And so my family, when I brought my last bust of James Madison home, my wife said, "Don't we have enough busts?" And I thought, my God, what a strange question. How can you have enough, too many busts of James Madison?
I hate to tell you, I have several busts of Andrew Jackson in my house.
Oh my God. I tripped that wire.
My son's actually, his name is Andrew Jackson Bain. If your house ever burns down, you can just say, look, it's the closest I can get to Madison. His house was burnt down. My house burnt down. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Living today, because if it was the framers, I would choose Benjamin Franklin because he would be the best to go out for beers with. But living today, boy, that's a really good question. It's not Hunter Biden. I'm pretty sure of that.
Or Stormy Daniels.
That might be a close one. I'm not sure, but probably not.
That might be one. That might be one bust too many.
Yeah, the problem that I have in answering that question is I do terrible things with my heroes. Because when I was working at NBC, I was walking out of NBC and I heard Tim Russert say, "Jonathan, hold up." And I stopped. He said, "I want you to introduce you to someone." And this would have been the person I would have named, but he's passed now. And around the corner comes Walter Payton. And he walks up and I said, "You're Walter Payton." And he said, "Yes, I am." I said, I had your poster in my room growing up." He said, "That's great." And I said, "You're Walter Payton." And he said, "Yes." I could only say, "You're Walter Payton" over and over again, to the point that Tim Russert said, "He's a little more talkative on air." And Payton put his arm around me and said, "We'll talk again." It must happen to him all the time. And he walked away. And I still wake up at night screaming. I could have, all the things I could have asked Walter Payton. So I'm afraid to go to dinner with anyone now because of the Payton situation.
I will only say that my sports hero as a kid, and I was born in 1967, was Larry Zonka, because I'm a Dolphins fan. And Larry Zonka came on my podcast for almost 2 hours, and he was an absolute delight.
Wow.
So we're just going to put down not Hunter, not Stormy as your. How about Mitch Daniels, George Will, Britt Hume?
The thing with George is I've gone out to dinner with him before. I must tell you, George is exactly as you would expect at dinner. It's like a concentrated college course for 90 minutes. And you come away and you're smarter than you were before, but you are exhausted. But I would always say George Will because he makes you smarter.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Jonathan Turley. He is the author of a very readable and also brilliant book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. Professor Turley, I loved it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.